looking at negativity as a positive thing, you would say, let's think of all the ways this could go south and see how many of them we could address before we say it's too hard to do. Because if the upside's really great and you could address most of what could be your failure points, then imagine how innovative that idea could be. We should rebrand failure, and that creativity favors the brave because failure is a natural part of creativity.
We've all heard garbage in, garbage out, but this kind of feels more like creative in, creative out.
It's not that the innovative ideas are little light bulb moments that you just go execute. Sometimes it is about getting through the barriers or the obstructions to seeing how it could be executed.
Hey, Chuck, hit me with a stat.
Sure, Nick. Here's a stat for you. 84% of executives say innovation is critical, but only 6% think their company actually does it well.
So basically, everyone's dreaming of innovation, but only a few are actually getting out of bed.
Exactly. And that's where our guest today, Leslie Grandy, comes in. She's worked at companies like Amazon, Best Buy, and T-Mobile. In fact, she launched the first online video subscription service before Netflix was even a thing. And she's here to dismantle the myth that creativity belongs in a box labeled Innovation Lab.
This one gets real. Leslie talks about why traditional innovation labs often fail. They alienate the rest of the org and create a weird creatives versus doers culture. And they forget to invite, the finance and legal teams who actually know how to bring things to life.
Yeah, and wait till you hear about the genius wireless picture frame her team built, only to realize too late that they couldn't sell it because, oops, the billing model didn't exist. It's the perfect example of what happens when innovation forgets to include operations.
She also dives into how anyone, yes, even you, spreadsheet wizard, can tap into creative problem solving, and that creativity isn't just art. It's legal hacks, ops flows, and even picking the right bananas at curbside pickup. Long story, trust me.
We even get into how generative AI can boost, not replace, creative thinking. If you've ever wondered how ChatGPT could help you solve a problem with analogies involving fleas and basketball shoes, then, well, this is the episode.
It's packed with insights, some laughs, a little cabbage instead of lettuce, and a healthy dose of why are we still doing it this way anyway?
So if you're ready to think differently about how innovation actually happens, let's get frictionless. Welcome to the show, Leslie.
Well, thanks for having me, Chuck and Nick. It's terrific to be here.
Should be an interesting conversation. Now, you began your career, as I recall, in box software before transitioning to digital media. Tell us about that.
It feels like when I say that, I feel like what it was like when my grandparents were marveling at 8-track stereo. It just feels like so long ago that you would go into a store like a CompUSA and see the choices you have and then walk out with a box with a handbook in it that was 500 pages and a bunch of discs. But yeah, in the late 90s, I began my career after I had a 13-year career in the film industry, and I was a member of the Directors Guild of America. And I went back and got my MBA at the University of Washington, and my first job was to do the IPO roadshow film for a box software company called Visio, which was drawing and diagramming software. And then after that internship, I was hired as a product manager. And from there, I worked in digital media, in wireless, e-commerce, hardware, and had the experience of really being on the front end of innovation, even in mature companies that were looking to not only stay competitive, but maybe disrupt a category. And so my experience may be different in verticals, but it was the same kind of job across the verticals.
You launched the first online video subscription service before Netflix and before Hulu, correct?
That's correct. Myself and about 11 other people are co-authors of a patent that was ultimately owned by Intel. I think it expired last year, but it was for a client server experience for authorizing digital subscriptions. When I was at Real Networks, we created a system and method for determining what rights people had and what they could view based on their subscriber status.
Let's talk a little bit, because I know you've mentioned that innovation labs and that you've had them. What are the common pitfalls of corporate innovation labs, and why do they often fail to produce meaningful results?
I really love this question. It's probably one of the things that I wish was talked about more because I think people are convinced into building these innovation labs, oftentimes by consulting agencies who want to show them in a sort of black box way how innovation can be done and sort of train people in the proper course of action. The problem that I've seen time and again, and it doesn't matter what size of the company or what type of company is, they end up alienating the rest of the business that is responsible for day-to-day improvements and day-to-day customer experience and day-to-day customer support. And it really creates two classes of employees. One is a group of employees who are deemed worthy of being inside the box, inside that innovation lab, and are the most creative because they get to play in all sorts of areas that they're allowed to explore and prototype and do things, and potentially even be more likely to accept failure because they know in innovation there's some percentage hit to miss ratio. The rest of the business often doesn't tolerate risk, often doesn't tolerate that hit to miss ratio, and therefore treats the employees who are not a part of the innovation lab as if they are less than, less creative than, less innovative than. And so what ends up happening is these two classes of citizens struggle to operationalize an idea from the innovation lab in the real business because the innovation lab maybe didn't have the full expertise of everyone in the business that might be impacted by the innovation, or because the prioritization of new work versus existing business is very hard for a business in operation mode to take. Let's stop the thing we're doing, make resources available to do this new thing that came out of the innovation lab from left field. And now we've got to synthesize that into our roadmaps, into our strategy, and into our plans. And that's very disruptive for people. The other thing I think is it gives the illusion that creativity is aligned to a role. And I really believe that creative people live throughout the organization. Some of the most creative people I have had are lawyers and finance people who've helped me figure out how to get something done that didn't seem possible to do. Right. And so you rarely see a finance and legal person in an innovation lab. But that's where some of the most exciting innovation is from a customer experience perspective, right? Things that you're able to do to take payments in a different way or to create a different business model around something. But those people then are not perceived as creative because they're not part of the lab, and it's very demoralizing to the employees.
Yeah, that second part resonates with me personally because I kind of embody that. Behind me, a bunch of cameras. So I was in film school, and now I've led the life of an engineer. So by traditional standards, I should not be creative. I should not be an idea person, but by my instinct, I am, and that's my core. And in fact, that's how I solve problems.
And what you just said, Nick, that to me is really the impetus for why I wrote the book at all, is because I think I went through that journey where I thought creative was defined in a particular way, right? That it was either an art form where you use some sort of medium or that you were able to design things and so therefore your creative capacity was limited if you had a role that wasn't that. If you had a role that was an engineer, if you had a role that was a lawyer. Um, and when you're disrupting business, particularly in digital transformation, when you're disrupting business, you need smart lawyers and finance people as well to be okay that you might be doing something that hasn't been done before. I think about the biggest creative disruption we all know, which was Uber for the taxi industry, and what how much of that creative destruction came from lawyers appreciating what they were taking on, right? In terms of the transportation industries in all the various locales, right? That you could define the product, but if the lawyers couldn't figure out how to operationalize that product, would it be the product we have today, right? Where I could just go stand on a street corner and find anybody and not hail a cab to get from here to there. And so I think about those things as opportunities to encourage people who aren't normally in that kind of corporate environment perceived as in a creative job like you described. And that is the opportunity for someone to realize problem solving actually is a form of creative expression. That is what I think is the net of what you just said. You are still in a creative job. You're just solving problems creatively as opposed to creating art, which isn't the only form of creativity.
So, and you experienced this disconnect between an innovation lab and the rest of the company when you were at T-Mobile. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we had an IDEO designed innovation lab, and it was separated in a different part of the city. And so people literally had to drive over to participate in it. And then when you'd get there, you'd be in this sort of playground of an office that looked nothing like the corporate headquarters intentionally. And so you'd sort of almost arrive a little bit with both the excitement that you're going to have playtime and sort of a chip on your shoulder when you left because you got to go back to the cube farm, right? And so that definitely created the cultural antagonism, right? That duplicity of culture within the company. But when we did come up with a really genius idea of through ethnographic research and customer collaboration, we were able to come up with this 3G enabled wireless picture frame, and it solved a really amazing problem for people who were buying Wi-Fi based picture frames, but that had a memory card. And it became really apparent that nobody ever changed the memory card. And especially if you gave that picture frame to your grandparents so that they would have pictures of you that you had captured digitally, that was permanently what it was. And while that was better compared to a regular photographic picture frame with a piece of paper and that never changed, the promise and the potential of that technology was more than that. And we knew as a wireless carrier that if you actually put a SIM card in there and treated it like it was a phone, it could actually receive pictures all the livelong day, right? And pictures could be updated when nobody was at the house. And when you'd walk in the door, you'd see new pictures of your grandkids without even doing anything. And it was so well received in research and so well received in prototyping stages that everybody said, "Oh, we've got to get this out for Christmas. We're going to just sell tons of them. There's just nobody who wouldn't want this as a gift this Christmas." The one thing the innovation lab did not have was anyone who understood how we sold products as a wireless carrier at the time. And this was in 2007 before we actually had iPhones and Android phones, and you could not buy a data only plan. There were no data only products. So unless you were a customer already of T-Mobile, you couldn't buy that frame because you would have to have a T-Mobile cell phone contract for it. And so what ended up happening was, yeah, we sold a reasonable number to our own customers, but it did nothing to get people to move over to T-Mobile because we had no way to sell it as your first purchase product. You had to become a cell phone product and then add a data product to it. And so we ran I think I want to say 20, 30,000 of them for Christmas. We probably could have sold 200 to 500,000 of them if that problem had been solved. But then we never sold it again because hadn't we hadn't justified with that amount the real expense to turn into a company that sold data only plans to consumers.
I'll tell you what's really interesting. We just went through a hackathon, and in that hackathon, I was just talking to some other teams. It didn't happen in my team, but there were certain teams that had people who were, I guess you could say, they were shooting ideas down because it would be too hard to implement, or they were thinking. And I thought of an old sales adage that was very similar in nature, which is don't let instrumentation get in front of selling. Very similar, don't let instrumentation get in front of ideation. And so the combination, it's really interesting that you're talking about this coming literally. I mean, this was last week that we did this hackathon, and we had these teams that were just saying, oh, well, every idea got shut down because this or that or the other. And we had all these great ideas, but nothing could come to fruition. And then we had a whole bunch of presentations from some teams that weren't saying that, which was just AI this, AI that. And then we had some really sound ideas that were very easy to instrument from teams that had that grounded base as well. So it's like this yin and the yang that kind of came together, and some ideas were just pie in the sky. And I mean, sure, that sounds great, but what does AI mean? Yeah, okay, we're gonna install AI.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that is interesting about what you described is it's not bad to have people tell you how hard it might be to implement, but the attitude and the approach at which that news is delivered really is meant sometimes to shut down the exploration of what it could take to get it done, and also doesn't usually come with an innovative solution in order to help get it done. Well, that's going to be hard, but if we did this, right, we might be able to get around that problem. And that's why I said sometimes some of the most creative people I've had as lawyers, where I feel like I've hit a wall with an idea or a negotiation or a product idea that we want to partner with someone on, and we have to kind of come step back to go forward again because it just looked like we were having our conversation at a level of negativity, not positivity. So if you can step away, right, you can turn that almost into sort of a creative problem solving technique called inversion thinking, which would be what's the worst that could happen if we did this, right? And then you give people permission to be somewhat negative, but you're doing it in the how do we address them then? How do we think about those ideas that are going to be hard to do because there's all these failure points? Can we address each of those failure points before we throw the idea out? Just having those failure points identified shouldn't be enough of a reason to kill the idea. And that I think is a function of having those people be a part of the creative team or see themselves as part of the creative team rather than part of the idea prevention organization, right? And so I think that's a cultural thing that companies do that actually creates internal friction and creates the opportunity for those antibodies to actually take hold, right? To actually have value and be meaningful enough to stop a good idea from coming to life.
Yeah, definitely have to have the open mind. Enter those kinds of exercises with an open mind.
And also, but again, looking at negativity as a positive thing, you would say, let's think of all the ways this could go south and see how many of them we could address before we say it's too hard to do. Because if the upside's really great and you could address most of what could be your failure points, then imagine how innovative that idea could be.
Yeah, that's spot on, and that's kind of the advice I kind of started giving some people was just saying, hey, let the idea just be fleshed out. Like just talk it through. Don't worry too much about, oh, that database would be so hard to build. Like, okay, well, how hard? Let's let's build it. Like, is it worth it to build it?
And frankly, I've run engineering teams, although I'm not an engineer and I don't code. I've been a leader of engineering teams for so long because I do appreciate them, just like the designers and the product managers, as being contributors to the idea, being people that can make an idea better, that can look at an idea differently, right, than the originator of the idea. And that capacity, right, to imagine how it could get done better, if I know what it is you're trying to do, is what I count on in my engineering team. Yeah, the product person, the design team may have come up with some customer focused idea that they got out of some research or ethnographic project they did. But then when you bring it to the engineer, it's like, how would you think about solving this problem? And people are so quick to jump to the answer and then push it to the engineer to go build it. And instead, what I've always enjoyed is putting the idea that we're trying to solve in front of the engineer and then letting them know this is one solution. Is there another? Is there a different one, a better one, a harder one, but it has better results? Like how would you solve this problem knowing this is how these two folks think of the solution set? And so that it not just an open mindset. I think in some ways it's a comfort with perspective shifting. I want to kind of go one step past that open mindset because for you to let go of the need to create friction against someone else contributing to the idea, for that to be something you're willing to let go of, you have to be willing to hear their perspective. You have to be willing, not so much to empathize with it or love it, but you have to be willing to say, why do they see it differently? And what if I was them, why would I pick this as the answer?
Yeah, and you're really tapping on a good concept that we talk about regularly called product bias, which is basically to say you've come up with an idea and you force your data to prove that that is a good idea.
Yeah, totally. That's a kind of a total confirmation bias, right? You're looking for something that proves you're on the right track.
And dismiss all the facts that would suggest otherwise.
Right, and the other part too is it's comfort with ambiguity because sometimes there isn't data or the past data wasn't appropriately aligned to the new solution or the pivot or the place that you want to go. And while it's helpful, you may not have the data that says if we add this functionality or we pivot in this way or if we disrupt the order of things. Like one of the great examples I think of this type of innovation, we've all thought about when you go to the grocery store and you do your pick and pack yourself and then you go to a checkout counter and then you put your bags in your cart and you go to your car. When curbside pickup became like a thing, it's because the entire order shifted. right? I pay for it before you pick and pack it. I literally am ordering and paying ahead of goods being delivered to me, which has never happened in a physical grocery store before, right? And so now you've actually reduced friction. I don't have to get out of my car. I don't have to find a parking space. It's usually a curbside pickup space right up front. So the friction for me is actually much less. But it came from doing something I could never have imagined suggesting, which is I'll go pay and then have some stranger go pick and pack it for me. Like the idea that that could be better for me required me to be comfortable with that perspective shift, right? That I'm not the one who has to pick all my stuff out.
Can we talk for a minute, though, about trusting someone else to pick your bananas?
I have a worse story for that because the first time I ever did Instacart. Now, pick and pack at the store is a little different because it's a store employee who I feel is a little bit more proximate to the goods, right? But when I was an Instacart shopper during the pandemic, I asked for a head of lettuce and I got a head of cabbage. And I just thought to myself, I can't even pretend they're the same thing. Like they don't even make the, like they're not the same thing. But it was green and it was round, and I looked, I was like, did I order a head of cabbage? No, I ordered a head of lettuce. So I totally agree with you. I do have a preference to make sure that I know the greenness of my bananas, as you point out, when they get picked. I do get that. But I do think curbside pickup just for anything, right? We did curbside pickup at Best Buy. I know what headsets I want. You go find them for me in the back room or in the store and meet me at the curb, and I'll have already paid for it. It's just, again, it's disruptive and yet convenient, super convenient for me.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I will say, from my perspective, the risk of the color of banana is worth the convenience.
But that's a choice, right? But that's a customer choice. And you can see it stayed around, right? Post pandemic,
Right.
It's still a thing. It's still something people want. And I'm sure some number of Instacart shoppers stayed Instacart shoppers because they recognize convenience of it, the benefit of it, and the lack of friction in worrying about, where do I park and how long am I going to take at the checkout line and so forth.
I will say Best Buy, because I did curbside during pandemic with Best Buy, and it was so much easier because you were getting a known specific item, and it was so convenient. You just roll up and they bring it out. I'm like, I kind of like that. That's kind of convenient.
It's so awesome, though, to your point, because that you're not going to get the green banana problem, right? That's so perfect.
And the geofencing is very clever. I placed an order for Chick-fil-A, which uses the geofencing, and then totaled my car on the way to Chick-fil-A. So I showed up like 3 hours later for the order, and they hadn't made it yet because they knew I hadn't gotten to the parking lot.
So funny. I'm sorry about the accident, but boy, that is a classic customer problem. That is the fringe case you don't think about when you plan the product, right? What happens if they have an accident on the way to pickup?
It does kind of remind me of our talk with Adam from Dunkin', where he was saying that some users would get creeped out by it because you could identify, hey, you're next to a Dunkin', here's a notification, go buy a coffee. And people are like, whoa, hold up, uninstall.
Yeah, I definitely feel like friction can go to creepy. There is no question, that removing friction can go so far that the pendulum swings to creepy. I totally appreciate that. But when you think about the experience, just going to the Best Buy experience for a second, when you do in-store pickup, it's a little closet in the front of the store. And so it's great for, small appliances, headphones, things like that. But what if you were coming to pick up your 80-inch television set? It doesn't fit in that closet. A refrigerator isn't going in that closet. And if you're coming with a van or you're coming to pick up something and you do in-store pickup and then you wait in that line and then you find out when you get to the counter that the product actually isn't there yet, it's because it has to stay in the back and then get carried forward. That's what actually made the geofencing make sense, because now you don't have to get out of the car. You don't have to go tell the person you're here. You've now told them you're here, and the TV can make it from the back of the store to the front of the store, and they can start moving it in that direction, right, when you pull into the parking lot because they get the signal. And I think in that particular case, there is no creepy factor because what the alternative is unpleasant, right? The unpleasant version of it, of waiting in line only to find out now you have to wait another 10 minutes for someone to go run to the back to get it.
Yeah, and furthermore, the creepy factor goes down because this person's already engaging with the brand. They're choosing to drive there. Whereas in Adam's case, it was somebody's just walking by a Dunkin' and then it says, hey.
Well, speaking of creepy, how can generative AI support creativity instead of replace it?
I think one of the things that becomes really important when you partner with generative AI on creative problem solving is the frameworks and techniques that you use. And so rather than just randomly asking a question and then iterating on an idea, there are actual creative thinking, creative problem solving techniques that are really perfect to partner with AI on because first, AI has psychological distance from the problem. They're not invested, they don't lose their job. It's not a, the risk level isn't an issue, right? So suggesting something random is what is okay. It's actually what you want, right? You want something you hadn't thought about. The idea that you could put A and B to get H, right, together is something that maybe I wouldn't have considered. So when you want to use a framework, whether it's an analogical thinking framework, give me an analogy to this problem in other arenas that I can look to for a solution for my problem. So, a good example of working with AI on this type of framework would be suppose I want to improve the check in experience at my health clinic. And I just feel like it's the place I get the most complaints. Well, I could consider creating the scenario of check in and ask AI, thinking of all the places where people check in, what experiences exist that I might be able to leverage to make my experience more efficient? And then they might look at the airport where you check in, right? Because you check in multiple times at the airport. Or they might look at a check in for a hospital and they'll say, oh, well, that's too similar. That problem's not the same. So it might look at places where similarity is too close and you could have figured it out on your own. But it might also look at places that seem so far fetched that when they bring it back, you now have a new area of exploration. So to me, I look at it as the research assistant. Go out and tell me what I haven't been thinking about that might exist in science or nature that could be applied to this problem. How might I think about deconstructing this problem to find solutions that are relevant to it? And these kind of frameworks then help AI sort of stay on point and then give you something to iterate from and relate to. So you're starting with your problem, you're starting with their solution, and you try to bring those two together because the attachment to the new idea is very light. Nobody, if you told them I don't want to do that, come up with three more, it would, right? So you're seeing the idea that you can get velocity, you can get more through the pipeline to consider than what you might be biased in your cognitive skills against thinking about. Like I might not think about the military when I'm thinking about shopping. So why would I look for a solution, right? In how this happens in a different domain altogether. And so for me, even thinking about a new product idea, I might put that new product idea into AI and come back with 10 things that I wouldn't have thought of that are all bad. But at least I've realized, right, that I've explored corners that I wouldn't have gone to myself. So one of the things I thought about in combinational creativity, where you look at what do you take from two things to make something better, I said, just to be random, I said to ChatGPT, what if I took a colander and a toothpick? What product could I make by combining those things? Right? And why would you want to do that? Well, my mind was, I thought about the toothpick as being what I use to get stuff stuck in the holes out. So when things get dried or caked in the holes, I use a toothpick for that. So I wondered if it would come up with some way to create an accessory that would help me keep my colander clean if I had a toothpick. It came up with 10 ideas I would never have imagined. Not that it was related to my actual problem, because they didn't say I'm looking to clean the colander, because maybe some, I just wondered what it would do, and it's there that you go, wow, that is not the answer to my question, but that is a product idea that I might be interested in exploring for completely different reasons. And so it creates the opportunity for you to see the random, the extreme, and to at least explore that in a way that amplifies your own thought pattern. But my recommendation, it has been, especially after doing the research and writing the book, is that to use a known framework makes the exploration more efficient and more constructive.
So let's talk about your new book, Creative Velocity. What are some of the core themes in your book?
For the book, I have 10 chapters, and in each chapter, I interview an accomplished creative thinker who had influence in my own career. So it includes Tony Fadell, who was the originator of the iPod and the founder of Nest Labs, Scott Belsky, who most recently was at Adobe and is now at A24 Studios, and a number of entrepreneurs and executives. And one of the things that I ask everybody is, how do you see the acceptance of failure as it relates to creativity? What is the importance of the acceptance of failure in relation to creativity? And to a person, the idea that failure was something they would run away from is what just didn't exist. Everybody felt that failure was a necessary attribute of their success, and that they own that failure as a contributor, right, to the accomplishments they've had for whatever reason. Maybe it was a lesson around who you partner with and how you partner, or maybe it was a lesson around execution. But to a person, everyone considered failure as not a loss, or, in a win-loss column, or a setback. It's some amazing quotes that I got from people. One of them was that we should rebrand failure, and that creativity favors the brave because failure is a natural part of creativity. The other theme, and I asked everybody this: what is the role of human creativity in the age of generative AI? And everyone felt somewhat differently about it in the particulars, but they all felt that it was a complementary or symbiotic relationship, and not one that was about replacement or marginalizing, right, the human creative aspect, right? That the idea was it was an amplifier, and it was actually as good as humans can make it, because humans are responsible for the data and the large language models that go underneath it. And so it depends on human creativity and understanding what those things that should be the underpinnings of it are. And so that the idea that one might replace the other or marginalize the other was just non-existent in anyone I interviewed.
That's interesting. I've said this several times, maybe not in this podcast format. This might be first year, but several times just in conversations. I feel like AI is inherently going to be lowest common denominator, in the sense that it's using all of the information that it can, and it's going to find the average answer for any specific question, any specific prompt. Therefore, creativity is actually amplifying the AI result. Now, your example of the colander with the toothpick kind of questions that whole mentality, because it's such an outlier. But when you're simply asking AI for something like, hey, give me a summary of this email, that's giving you the lowest common denominator of that result to say, this is the basis of it.
Yeah, and I think what you hit on, though, is kind of the point. It's, what do you use it for? What is the question, and what is the not just the prompt you engineer, but the accomplishment you're aiming for, right? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to get an answer and then walk away from it? At which point it's going to assume you accept that answer and use it as good, right? Because you didn't iterate it or you didn't challenge it. Or are you trying to explore something with an outcome that is maybe a little less predefined? And that's why when I say these frameworks are helpful, because they intentionally create that open-ended nature to the exploration. When you talk about an open mindset, you want AI to have a little bit of an open mindset in order to get the full benefit of it. And so part of what you want to provide them is, yeah, some boundaries perhaps, so you're not doing the random thing that you don't have time to go parse through perhaps, but not also just say, I've fallen in love with this answer, tell me the best way to give me that answer, right? Which is sort of a little bit summarize this email or summarize this book. So when I use Notebook LM, it's only as good as my book, because that's what I uploaded was my book, right? If I ask a question of it, I'm basically asking a question of my book. But if I go to ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude and I say, I'm trying to solve this problem and I'm looking for other solutions that might be similar, or other aspects of products that I could combine to solve this problem, what should I think about? The speed at which it can come back with alternatives allows me to be open-minded, because then I have to go say, well, I may get a bunch of junk, but even if 70% of it is junk, then the 30% is what I'll iterate on, and it'll know that's the good, right? The stuff I picked to iterate on is the stuff that I think is interesting. And so now I'm giving it better feedback to get better outcomes later.
Yeah, we've all heard garbage in, garbage out, but this kind of feels more like creative in, creative out.
Yeah. I think you're trying to create a structure that allows you to iterate. And the structures that are in the book and are known creative thinking techniques are really about the guardrails, so that you're not wandering aimlessly, but you're looking to solve a problem, but without the answer in front of the problem. And I think that's one of the things, to your point, that product teams tend to do. I have the answer in mind. Now I just got to go figure out how to build it. And this is a different kind of conversation. I want to make sure I've looked at all the answers before I pick one, and I want to explore the ones I hadn't thought of before I actually move forward with any one of them. And so it's just, I think, a different goal for that type of interaction. And so if it is creative, I want to get the most creative answers back, as to what I could see. Now, having said all of this, there are also the risks that you see this in all the fine print. There's some hinky stuff you sometimes get back. And so that's the other part of human creativity, is that discernment piece, where you're really able to say, I get it, but that is not culturally appropriate. Or I get it, right? But that is not something I think is as funny, as I want it to be. And I need a little humor to delight my customers, right? Humor, things like that, right? The subtleties of the human experience are the other part of that creative process. And you can't count on generative AI to get all of that. It's not fully sentient. And even if it is, my sense of humor isn't necessarily yours. You know, what triggers me may not trigger you. Right. So when you look at the partnership with generative AI, you really do want to bring that aspect of discernment into the creative process, so that you're actually bringing meaning out of that partnership. You're bringing actual value and meaning, not just 50 ideas.
So Leslie, what's a widely held belief about using creativity to create frictionless digital experiences that you fundamentally disagree with? You think people get wrong?
I do think we talked about it at the beginning. I do think that there are people who think that they have creative jobs and people who think they don't. And that myth is so limiting to so many people. It limited me for a lot of my career in fulfilling my sense that I wanted to live a creative life, but I have no artistic talent. I couldn't play a piano or carry a tune in a basket. I can't, I've taken acting lessons and art lessons, and I don't have those skills. But once I recognize that I can bring creativity to problem solving, that creative expression and problem solving aren't that far apart, I recognized I didn't have to have a design job, or I didn't have to be an artist or a photographer or a cinematographer in the film industry, right? I had to see myself as having the capacity to solve problems creatively. And I think that is, over the years of coaching people on my teams, I've seen that as the biggest myth that people subscribe to, which is, it's not my job to come up with a great idea. I'm the one who implements it. Or it's not my job, so I'm going to leave that to the design team. Or I don't have the skills. Well, you can get the skills. And that's the other part of this myth, is it's really easy to practice and develop the capacity to use these frameworks to think creatively about problems, to look at places that you wouldn't expect. Like, I love an operations person who says, why don't we do this part of the process? I just don't know why we even do this. Well, we've been doing it for 10 years. Okay, what if we stopped doing it? And so being able to kind of give people the power to do the what if we didn't do this, or what would happen if, right, who aren't in those jobs that are perceived to be creative, I think it opens the door for not only not needing an innovation lab, but also for kinds of solutions that can be game changing for a business. Another great example of this is, who would have believed the buy now, pay later thing would work on e-commerce, right? It's so layaway, old fashioned department store thinking. So who would have thought a Klarna or a firm would be a thing now, where you could actually get the goods sent to you and you haven't paid anything? Like, that's crazy. But again, somebody had to figure out the financial aspect of that, right? And what that financial product was that supported that customer experience. And there's no question they had legal and finance and ops people involved in that discussion, right? So to me, one of the really big fallacies around creative thinking is that it's only available to a certain few.
Awesome. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. How can listeners connect with you if they want to follow up?
Well, I just launched the book website, creative-velocity.com. And if you buy the book from the site, you actually get bonus content, including extra interview content that didn't make it into the book. And then I'm available, obviously, on LinkedIn as well.
Well, we appreciate you being here today and appreciate everybody tuning in for this episode of the Frictionless Experience podcast. Be sure to follow the podcast on LinkedIn, and anytime we have a new episode, you'll hear about it, or on your favorite podcast platform. Also, if you've not signed up for our newsletter, you can do that at thefrictionlessexperience.com. And share your biggest innovation challenge with Nick and me on LinkedIn. We'd love to discuss it on future episodes. I am at Chuck Moxley at LinkedIn, and Nick is
In Palladino.